the barber was telling friends of his that black people can't learn and they're stupid. And I had my master's degree in education. And even the blacks at that time would pick the white doll. Most blacks did not have cars, so you would have to take a bus with white people dancing on one side and black people on the other side, even though they were listening to the same music. But you couldn't cross the rope. My name is Reginald Petty. I was born in, it gets complicated, I was conceived in East St. Louis, Illinois, but born in St. Louis, Missouri, because the two hospitals in East St. Louis at the time were for white only. And African Americans were born either at their homes or a branch of Bourne's Hospital in St. Louis. And, but after our birth, we returned to East St. Louis where we were raised. Exactly, because everything in East St. Louis at that time was segregated. And there were a few, I think 2 or 3 black doctors, but they really came to your home at that time if you were ill. But none of the white facilities, the hospitals or any other health facilities would accept African Americans at that time. Most blacks did not have cars, so you would have to take a bus. And so it got complicated, obviously, but after we were born, we returned to our homes in East St. Louis, and that's where we were raised. Oh yes, you lived all the neighbor. The only place where you would see white people were again at the white stores in your neighborhood, who owned your neighborhood. Because very few blacks owned stores. My grandfather had a first grocery store, a black grocery store, but he was the only one, and all the others in your community, even though they were grocery stores or whatever they might be, with very few exceptions, would be white people who were making money from the black community, but they didn't live in the black community, and there was clearly no social activities until even when people like Chuck Berry, who was one of the creators of blues, rhythm and blues, and Ike and Tina Turner, all of those clubs were black, but in this, I guess in the 50s, they began to integrate a little bit, but even that was black people, white people would come to maybe to hear the black music, but you were not allowed to go to the white clubs to hear that, so it went one way. Even in SIU Carbondale, when I went down there to school, there was a little town called Culp, Illinois, which was very close to Carbondale, and it had a bar there, and that had live music, and for a while they had a rope down the center of the club, with white people dancing on one side and black people on the other side, even though they were listening to the same music, but you couldn't cross the rope. So there was no integrated dancing or anything like that. You didn't do anything like that. When the civil rights, when it began to force integration, I guess that's the best way to put it. But you still had some places that if you went to, you were taking your life in your own hands if you just went in there. So it was still fairly segregated. In Carbondale, there were certain black clubs and certain white clubs, and no real mixture. And it's the same thing in most movie theaters. There were black theaters and there were white theaters. It was a feeling that it was a very much of a feeling that you still see now among some white people, that it's important for them to think of themselves as superior to somebody, and it means the black people. And it's because if particularly when I think of, I almost want to say when I used to think of poor white people, certainly from places in the South, they were being discriminated against by their own white people, but it was economic. But so the one group that they had, they could say, at least I'm superior to these black people. At least there's somebody who's below me. Whatever I do, I am superior to them. And I remember telling somebody the story of one of my arrests in the South, where I was in a barber chair, and the white people were shaving my head. And the barber was telling friends of his that black people can't learn and they're stupid. And I had my master's degree in education, and he had about a 6th grade education. But he was saying, and I just started kind of laughing because it was just so ridiculous, But that's what he was telling his friends, as if I wasn't even there. I didn't exist.
Do you react to that situation?
I started giggling, and he looked at me and just not understanding why I was giggling. I would just, And I probably I could have been killed. It's hard to say. I could have been killed. I mean, it would have been an insult for me to even think that, and so you constantly ran into that, not even in the South, but in southern part of Illinois, at that time around Carbondale. That was that, and even into the rural areas, particularly, it was something that you had to keep in mind, because it was dangerous if you didn't. If you were stopped by a group of people if you were staring at just some white people or a white lady, I mean, this was dangerous. And when I started dating my second wife, who was Caucasian, it was just crazy. I mean, they were just. We were in Carbondale, the university. Created the first Job Corps, what they call a Job Corps, which is a training center in the United States. And Carbondale had the contract. And I was one of the ones who helped set that up. But it was done in Breckenridge, Kentucky. So we were down there, and my girlfriend at the time was with me. And we went in town I had to buy some clothes. And we went into this store together. And it's black and white. And the guy called the police and said, I want them out of here. And we were about to be arrested, except we told them we were going to the Job Corps. But if we had just gone in, we'd have been in jail. And it was just me going in to try to buy some clothes. Yeah. So it was this kind of nonsense, I guess the earliest memories was the fact that everything was segregated. For example, any stores in our area were usually owned by white people, usually the Jewish community at that time. And there were some Italians who had stores. But for example, if you went in to buy a suit or shoes, you were not allowed to try the shoes or the suit on. So you were almost guessing unless you absolutely know, your size and all of this. But you were not allowed to try on anything. Insurance people would come to your house, I remember, to collect 10 or 15 cents for the insurance. And these were always white people. And I remember the first time I met Europeans, it was the insurance people who would come to our house. And I also noticed that my parents' voice would change when they were talking to the white people. And there was a kind of a fear or a concern. And I remember at the time, too, we had a radio. And it flashes back now that all the shows we were listening to on the radio, if they had a black person in the show, he was usually a maid. She was a maid or something like that. And there were a couple of shows, Amos and Andy, which was one show which was made up of white people playing the role of blacks, but it was a comedy. And I remember Jack Benny and a couple of other shows in which there were maids in the show. This was even though this was radio, the tone of the voice made it clear that this was a inferior person in an inferior position. And so no blacks could be heroes, that we listened to. So the sense of who you are as a person, was certainly a factor as you were growing up. White people were superior. I think probably, well, I was aware that I was black, but I also was aware that I was inferior. But in terms of equality, I think I was probably almost going into junior high school, maybe 6th or 7th grade. Because I remember, even though my mother was a teacher, I was considered, because of that, she was a teacher and she was light-skinned. And I remember my grandmother said that we were exceptional because she was a lighter skin and she was a teacher. Even though at that time, you could get a 2-year teaching certificate. So she had only been to college for 2 years. So she was teaching elementary school. But there was very much this sense of white people are superior. In fact, there was, at that time, a bit of research was done in which I believe 5-year-olds were asked, 4 or 5-year-olds were given 2 dolls. And they were asked which was the superior doll. And even the blacks at that time would pick the white doll. My grandmother's parents, there used to be something called circuit preachers. And these were people who were ministers, but who could travel around to different sites of blacks in the South, preaching. And my grandfather was one of these, but at the time, from what I gather, he came home and there was some white person with his wife, and they had a confrontation. And he had to leave immediately, or he would have been killed in Mississippi, Scuba, Mississippi. And so they left, leaving everything behind, and came up to East St. Louis at that time. And my grandmother, I think, was probably in her teens. And by being in their position in Mississippi, they were living fairly well by black standards. So she was very upset that they had moved up here. And they were not living as well as they had in terms of economics and this kind of thing in East St. Louis as they had been in the South. And she was very upset at her parents for changing things. There were more opportunities for a minister for her at that time. But East St. Louis at that time, there were certain things you could be as long as you stayed behind the curtain, as long as you stayed in your role. You could teach, you could be a social worker, but if you were working in a business, you could work there, but you could not be a administrator. You could not be in a higher position. And this was true until the largest race riot in the United States was here in East St. Louis. in 1917. And this was because some people from the South had come to the aluminum ore company here, and had gotten jobs because there had been some union problems, and they were bringing in blacks from the South in certain positions, and so this produced a large riot in which hundreds of people were killed, and this was one of the largest riots in the history of the United States. They even had street gatherings in New York City because of the riot here.